Let's give another round of applause here to filmmaker. Again, this movie is not available for streaming or anything right now, so this was the Monterey premiere, so we're glad you all came out. And you know, obviously, a big props to the Sea Shepherd. Let's give them a big round. They've been doing great stuff for a long time, really cutting edge, and thanks for them coming down here from San Jose, the North California chapter. So I'm gonna start off with a couple questions for Ben and Natasha, and then Rachel's collecting the cards, and we'll do a representative sample of your questions as well, and we'll go till, again, another 30, 40 minutes. So my first question here is, obviously heroic efforts by the Sea Shepherd staff there, and Peter, who was the captain there for this venture. But given the scale of the problem, and there's not enough Sea Shepherd vessels, unfortunately, out there to police the entire high seas, what is the state of the efforts of actual governments around the world to do some of this enforcement and interdiction that Sea Shepherd has been taking on for themselves at this juncture?
If governments around the world were doing their job, you wouldn't have the direct action Sea Shepherd does in right now 12 different locations. Governments and fisheries department have traditionally stayed out of these geopolitical issues about protecting exploited species. So conservation groups, Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd are the only two that do so-called direct action. So to your question, whether Sea Shepherd is scalable enough to handle this global threat of overfishing, legal overfishing is an environmental crime, and it's much greater than illegal fishing, because we're talking about $100+ billion industry of extraction of fish, plated fish. And say tuna is about 40 billion of that, and of the 100, some say 120, 140 billion total, maybe a third or 40% of it is illegal. So the greater share of extraction of fish for consumption is by this environmental crime of the overfishing of legal fishing. So even though this film focuses heavily on a species that is not a global food security fish like tuna, but is a fish that the affluent eat around the world, it's the big story is really not in the Southern Ocean. It is in the Pacific. That's where the really big story is. And since China over the last 20 years has really bought up the Pacific, subsequently bought up the tuna, it's a crisis for the future with this global food security fish, tuna. This is way outside of this white gold of land sea bass. Natasha's a marine biologist. I think she can speak to this also.
Just in terms of looking at global fisheries, most of you are here.
Louder.
You can hear me. Globally, the ocean is in crisis. We all know this from a number of different fronts, and there are many different tools that we can use to try to protect the fishery, to try to keep a sustainable fishery. Here in California, we have a number of different tools that we use, including marine protected areas. And this is something that we're trying to do on a global scale, but California has been leaders to kind of bring it back to our local California here. And we know that if we close certain areas off to fishing, that fish don't know lines in the ocean, and they spill over and replenish other areas. So we're looking at that as one of many different tools in terms of management on a global scale, and especially looking at what California has done here.
So I want to kind of go back to something, Ben, that you just said that I think maybe was said quickly. So let's really hone in on this. And this is kind of echoing something that Sylvia Earle, many of you who know her, her deepness, has said, which is that the bigger problem is the overfishing that's legal. And let's unpack that a little and talk about what maybe some of those numbers, and then maybe we can bring it back. You know, Monterey here in this area, we're really home to a lot of the sustainable seafood movement, whether it's the Seafood Watch or it's Fishwise down in Santa Cruz, and the larger partners, kind of Marine Stewardship Council. So maybe if you could hone in on the kind of the legal overfishing, and then maybe your thoughts on the kind of these metrics of, quote, sustainable fishing, and your thoughts on those.
Well, the very word sustainable has been kidnapped by the industry. Sustainable means, the definition, the dictionary definition, is productive indefinitely. And the way the fishing industry works, it does a 2-year, a 4-year, and a 6-year. Indefinitely, as we know, is the grandchildren's grandchildren. So there's really no effort from an industrial standpoint to imagine sustainability. It's not in their game plan. The RFMO, which is the regional fisheries management organizations around the world, this is a little controversial, but I'm able to speak my mind because I don't work for anyone except the ocean. I think the whole management world of regulating so-called fishing and the bean counters of the global catch, it's one big cluster nightmare of no transparency, lying, duplicity, multiple sets of books, and you can throw NOAA in also. The problem is that the fishing industry is more secretive than the nuclear weapons industry, because you can't FOIA the fishing industry. You can't get freedom of information about the global catch. Daniel Pauly, who was part of the duo of Boris Worm and Daniel Pauly, saying that in 2048 it would be the end of industrial fishing because of the depletion and the collapse of fisheries around the world, that it wouldn't pay for industrial fishing vessels at the cost per kilometer to go out and fish if the geographic areas, one after another, had collapsed. So they're looking forward and saying it's all over for plate fish. Of course, there'll still be artisanal fishermen, there'll be a few grouper and snapper, and you'll find some fish around the world, but industrial fishing may be over if there's not some containment of legal fishing. And I personally see a very gray area between legal and illegal, because you've got countries like China, you've got oligarchs like Russian fleets, you've got the Cosa Nostra, you've got the Yakuza, you've got the Triad, you have all these mafia gangster organizations that are fishing, because fish, as the INTERPOL officer said in this film, fish is money swimming through the water. You don't have to fence it, you don't have to vaccinate it, you don't have to license it, it's just there, you pull it out and it's dollars in the hold. And a hold full of tuna could be worth $1 million. Where you caught it inside, illegally caught inside an EEZ where you weren't licensed, or you caught it on the high seas, or you transshipped it on the high seas. These are all nightmares for the global catch and for the future of tuna for our grandchildren. So it's a very bleak. I mean, I worked in social justice for 40 years making films about urban violence in America and the nightmare of black men killing each other in the ghetto and the problems of racism in America. That's what I did for 40 years, and I flipped the script about 6 years ago and started doing only ocean conservation and moved my whole operation of my company and my people to environmental justice, and we focused in on the ocean. So I'm not positive at all. And this is the only thing I read about and consume 7 days a week for the last 5 years is fishing and the nightmare of the idea that we would collapse the bounty of the sea that has been feeding 1.5 billion people in this 7 billion person world. So the nightmare of losing this protein, it shocks me that it's coming, and I don't know what's going to stop.
On that note, I think Jason referred to some of the programs that are in place to try to encourage the public. Here we are saying the oceans are depleted. What can we do as consumers? How can we make good choices with what we do have left? I think we're fortunate here in California in terms of quote-unquote sustainable fisheries. We do have a few examples here in California. Seafood Watch, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and other groups are trying to gear consumers to the right place and at least to be asking questions. I think the biggest thing everyone can do is if you are going to eat seafood, to find out what it really is and how it was caught and where it was from. And we're fortunate here in California where we can get local seafood from, even off the boat and know exactly where it came from. And in addition, there are lots of farm products out there. Same kind of questions. We want to know what they're eating, what the farm products are being fed is really critical. If you're fishing out in the ocean to grind it up into fish meal to feed a farm product, you're defeating the purpose. Yeah.
So I want to ask one about technology. There's been a lot of really interesting things in the news. Recently, we had actually someone from Sky Truth here, which is doing some satellite monitoring of fishing boats. As you mentioned, one of it is this kind of lack of transparency. It's a lot of kind of almost mafia-esque like organizations on the high seas here. So what do you think about the role potentially of this new technology to actually be able to track and see where the fishing is going on, both legal and illegal, and that might bring some kind of order to this kind of unsustainable madness as you kind of outlined?
I'm really prepared to answer this question. I could do it for an hour. I've been fascinated by the technology and how it comes to cause potential change in the fishing industry. Sky Truth, which is Google Map, which is Oceana Consortium, now they're off on their own. Tony Long is running it, who is an ex-Royal Navy intelligence officer for 17 years, and then he flipped to work in marine conservation. He knows how to find the bad actors at sea because he was looking for the enemies in a geopolitical sense because he was Royal Navy. It doesn't really, bottom line, it looks great, it's great to write about. I love a lot of the people that are working in it and all their idealism. I'm just not buying it because the bad actors turn off their AIS transponder, and that's how Global Fishing Watch is tracking the hundreds of thousands of vessels. If you're a bad actor and you're illegally fishing in an EEZ, you turn off their transponder, it's like you went dark. No one knows you're there. The other nightmare is there's a thing called the Port State Measures Agreement, which is a UN measure that's been passed by 50 countries. And it basically says when you come into port with a hole full of fish, you have to prove that you caught that fish legally. And the onus is on the captain. So the captain, of course, is working for a fleet owner, of course, who's only about the profits, of course, and he's lying, and he has counterfeit reports. And in a port that has the Port State Measures Agreement working, he's met by a small vessel that says, let me see your records where you got the fish. And remember, the fish is all commingled with legally caught, illegally caught. And the proof of what is the origin of that catch is shown to Port State Measure person like a peacekeeping force from the UN. That's what Port State is, the UN mandate to try to regulate the catch. They can't be bought off and bribed like most ports because they've got the Port State Measure going. The problem is it's hard to prove it. And if you can take the hold away from the ship owner and say we're confiscating this $1 million worth of fish, then you are starting to fund a watchdog organization. We're not sure how it's going to work. As Tony Long, who runs this whole Sky Truth thing for Bjorn and the guys in West Virginia, they're saying we don't want to try to find enough enforcement to go out there and get the bad guys. We want to catch them in port because they all have to come to port. But the Achilles heel of the whole Port State Measures Agreement is that they don't have to come to port because there's what's called high seas transshipment. So it's money laundering, fish laundering on the high seas with gigantic refrigerator fleets which appear in the process of fish as they're a port, but they're not in port. They're out in the high seas, and it's impossible to regulate that. So again, even though there's a lot of people planning a lot of control mechanisms to rein in this illegal catch, it's just extremely complicated.
So we have a couple questions that are kind of related to the movie, so I'll honor those first here. And so maybe we'll do these in a kind of A-B here. The first is, what is it that makes it illegal to fish for these Patagonian toothfish in the Antarctic? And the kind of companion question to that is does the Sea Shepherd actually have kind of jurisdiction to kind of make these arrests, or if not arrests, at least to, do some of this law enforcement work?
So the Sea Shepherd work, what we've got is we've got rampant criminality in the illegal fishery. We've got rampant environmental crime in the overfishing legal industry. And we have this, what you saw tonight, vigilantism. And is this vigilantism effective? Well, where the capacity of the fleet of Sea Shepherd, which is about a dozen steel hull vessels now, operating all over the world, that's not scalable for the problem. It would take hundreds of vessels like Sea Shepherd to do anything big picture. And the second question was, their jurisdiction comes from nowhere. It comes from the United Nations Charter on Nature, which says if any NGO, like you saw INTERPOL congratulating Sea Shepherd, and so INTERPOL, of course, is worldwide, cops for the whole world, that you can't get enough enforcement from an NGO like Sea Shepherd to even impact at all this global problem. But their jurisdiction is derived from their citing of the UN Charter for Nature. It says, if you see an environmental crime happening, intervene. And so they take it as a collective assignment for their capacity, which is vessels with 30 men and women, volunteers fighting for nature. That's where they derive their jurisdiction.
So let's get back to kind of the attempts on the consumer level, because I think this is something that a lot of people in the audience are interested in. Again, it's very active in Monterey, and I think some of the problems you've already outlined, which is even the best kind of certification system is only good as the quality of the information. And as you were just saying, some people will just lie, they'll turn off their transponders, the legal and illegal fish get commingled. And so I guess, and maybe this is for you, Natasha, what is your faith in the actual quality of the information that's feeding into these certification systems?
There's a number of different issues with the information. First of all, more than 50% of the fish that we eat here in the United States is imported from other countries. I think it's actually quite a bit more than 50%. The rule, 80%. The rules and regulations in those other countries in terms of country of origin and species identification are all over the map. So when we get that fish, it's commingled, as Marc mentioned, it's commingled, we don't know where it came from, what species it is, or how it was fished. So it's virtually impossible to do accurate traceability on imported fish. Here in the U.S., it's slightly different. We have required certain labeling requirements, but as you all know, when you go to the market, it's very rare that you know where the fish comes from. Or when you buy a can of tuna, where was that fish actually caught? Where it was caught and where it was processed can be completely different. I think we're trying to do the best we can with some of these certifications, but there's huge data gaps in the system that make it basically impossible to provide the consumer with accurate information.
I would also say that Natasha is a California marine biologist, and she would be very reluctant to say anything terrible about the Marine Stewardship Council. MSC, the little boat with the food that says it's okay to eat, it's sustainable. I'm East Coast, I'm not a biologist. I can scream fire in the auditorium and I'm not going to jail. I don't believe these NGOs, I don't believe CITES, I don't believe MSC. MSC was started by Unilever. It's an industry, if not controlled, certainly influenced organization. They want you to think this problem is not as bad as it is. I'm very much in the Daniel Pauly, Boris Worm, who my daughter introduced me to. I'm very much in the camp of we're in the middle of a bad dream And the ending of the bad dream is we collapse the bounty that nature gave this planet to feed all this protein to so many people. We are crashing it. That's my opinion, having been deeply immersed in everything I can read, 7 days a week for 5 years. And I think there's so much politics about people saying, if MSC is trying to protect this species, it's pathetic. Like what you saw tonight, you can imagine that you saw the Atlas Cove, which was a legal toothfish vessel, come into the picture of the Bob Barker and the Sam Simon. But then you had a legal fishing vessel attacking about the grandchildren need the fish, don't you overfish. You have a legal fisherman calling an illegal fisherman, a creep, and he's doing the wrong thing. It's pathetic because the amount of fish, of Chilean sea bass that served on this planet, last month, is greater than the so-called legal quota. And you have Paul Watson say, we took down illegal fishing in the Southern Ocean of the Patagonian toothfish. And Paul will boast about this, and of course he'd love to believe it's true. The fact is that any commercial fishing vessel that wants to make a fortune can decide to dip down into the Southern Ocean, do gill net fishing, catch $500,000, $250,000 worth of fish, freeze it in its hold, take off, transship at sea, or go to a port where it's not regulated, and sell that hold and make a fortune. So the amount of Chilean sea bass that's consumed is so much greater than the legal catch. So where's that coming from? It's the illegal fishery. So, it's the expression, something's rotten in Denmark. The whole fishing industry, to me, except you can cite certain examples of some good fishermen who have a conservation bone in their body, and there are plenty of them, but overall, it's a gigantic business, and it's very hard to control greed. Greed is evil, and that's what big business is about. And fishing, if petroleum is the greatest dollar figure in the world, which is I think about 800 or 900 billion a year, the next one down, if you think of steel, aluminum, corn, soy, all those other commodities, guess what? Fish is the next one, even though it's about 800 million lower than petroleum, that's the next biggest commodity in the world, fish. And it's such a big business that you're not going to get the truth, certainly not from the industry.
I rarely find somebody more pessimistic than I am, so this is... but truth is truth, and so we have to deal with reality as it is, and especially in this day and age. So let me throw out a few kind of maybe more affirmative kind of aspects of kind of on the consumer level, and get your thoughts on this. So I guess the first thing is, I personally, this again, I'm not speaking for the Institute here, I'm not speaking for the Center for the Blue Economy, which I represent, but I'm a student of these numbers, and what it led me to as a personal consumer was that I've been vegan for almost 26 years now, and because I couldn't find any producers who were producing animal products that met my ethical criteria. I just could not find it on a consistent basis. So I said, for myself, I'm just going to get out of that system. I don't want to be a part of that system. But for those who still want to be part of this system, what I have found is that I think there's a lot of shellfish in the industry that's actually quite sustainable, and for a few reasons. One is the lower on the trophic level you go, the more you're away from the really worst offenders. So what does this mean with seafood? It means, eating a swordfish, a bluefin tuna is essentially the marine equivalent of eating a tiger or a lion or a gorilla. And since most of us would probably feel morally or ethically compromised if we were eating a tiger or a gorilla, that's the seafood equivalent. But mussels, clams, shellfish is not, right? That's stuff that's much lower. I think also, luckily, there's plant-based aquaculture, right? So there's actually people now making kelp jerky. If you fry up dulse It actually tastes like bacon. We have our partner up the road here at Moss Landing, Mike Graham, doing some amazing stuff with that. So maybe that's part of the answer. Then we have cell-based, there's a company called Finless Fish that's basically doing the lab-grown version of kind of the meat. So they're actually trying to grow through cultured meat fish. And so maybe that's the answer, is the low trophic level, wild stuff, the plant-based aquaculture, and then the cell-based, and not the wild harvesting of seafood. And so I'm curious what our filmmakers think about that.
I mean, like these fish, especially like a bluefin tuna, yellowtail, big eye, this is wildlife, but as soon as it hits the deck of the vessel, it's extracting it, it's food, it's no longer wildlife. So when you have 7 billion people in the world, what's going to be valuable? Well, you're feeding them. And I'm not sure, we move towards veganism, vegetarianism, and this anti-meat movement, you know, Greta coming to town, you know, she's in New York on her way to Washington. Yes, Greta. So there's a lot, there's hope on the horizon, but to me, it's not scalable. This film is Paul Allen's Ocean Legacy that you just saw. He also gave us 6 hours to do, from which this film was extracted. Before he died, he's the founder of Microsoft with Bill Gates. And Vulcan, as you saw their name up there, they're part of the production group that did this, Discovery Vulcan, and my company, Brick City. We're working on a new film now that he commissioned before he died, and now it's tricky, you know, where the funding's going to come from. But it's about tuna, and that is the global food security fish. Unlike this land sea bass, which is really just for rich cruise ships and people having a $30 entree, you know, this flaky white fish. So we've moved to the skipjack tuna, and that's where you get all the canned tuna in the world. It's all skipjack. You don't put in bluefin or yellowfin or big eye. That's too valuable as a steak or as for sushi. So as a company that does political documentaries, of course, we're concerned with global food security fish like skipjack. And where is that heading? Is that going to crash? Is the pressure on skipjack so great that it'll eventually be $5 a can, and it won't be the $1 a can special that you get at the grocery store, which is cheap protein. If that's over, that is the canary in the coal mine. If tuna goes down, and you start reading about this in the next 5-10 years, then you can be sure we're in a lot of trouble. And you've got Barbara Block here in Monterey. You've got Pew on the East Coast, you know, researching the future of tuna. You've got all the islands in the Pacific, Central and Western Pacific. That's ground zero for skipjack tuna. Everybody's trying to cover for the industrial purse seine fishing industry. And the observers at sea who are watching and counting the catch of this industry, they're being pushed overboard and murdered. And that's actually the name of the new film I'm doing, called Murder at Sea, funded by Paul Allen. So he says I'm pessimistic more than him. I hope not, but I'm not sure. I wish I could bring some good news to this conversation. I just don't have any.
Maybe Natasha
Well, it makes me think about just this idea of, you know, where are we going to get our protein source if we still want to eat, you know, seafood from the ocean. And I moved out to California 15 years ago and started diving and going out with friends to collect and forage in the wild. If I had a choice, that's how I would eat all of my seafood, is to catch it myself. And I very unfortunately and sadly watched the entire North Coast ecosystem collapse before my eyes. We watched the warm water come in and kill off all the kelp, and sea urchin populations explode because we lost our sea stars that died from a disease that was proliferated probably due to the warm water. And then the entire abalone population basically diminish along the north coast of California. And this is not a good story, but it's an example of what's happening around the world, where where environmental conditions, climate change, 1 degree warm, for 1 year we had 1 to 3 degree warming in the water. It changed, the entire ecosystem collapsed, and I watched that before my eyes, and it's pretty devastating. And so this idea that I'd like to take my kids diving along the California coast and see, the life and the bounty here, that's changing. The reason why my dad and I are here tonight is because he took me diving when I was 10 years old, and I was hooked. I knew I wanted to be in the water and study the water, and grew up diving in Florida and in Florida Keys, and watched that entire ecosystem collapse. There used to be corals. There's no more coral left. There's still a few fish, but the entire coral reef is basically gone. So it's pretty incredible when you see something like that happen in my very, relatively short lifetime. So on that note.
All right, well, I often feel that I want to kind of end these events with something positive here, but I think maybe this will be the exception, in the sense that maybe the negative and the reality of what's happening is kind of what we need to sit with tonight. So let's give these filmmakers a big round for bringing this to our attention. Word here he wants to say, and again I want to mention again that the Center for the Blue Economy and the Environmental Policy Program, we have events every week. Again, they're all free and open, and please go to our website and check them out, and we'll see you again.
I would just say that thank God for, I'm an atheist, but thank goodness for Paul Watson and his unending energy to fight for the ocean as he has, and to create an atmosphere where hundreds and hundreds of volunteers go out to sea and do what you see here. They've got crews in the Galapagos, they've got crews in Costa Rica, they've got crews in the Sea of Cortez trying to protect the almost extinct vaquita. They've got crews in the Mediterranean fighting the dolphin bycatch. They've got crews fighting the whaling up in the North Sea, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. They've got crews in Taji, Japan. So the ships and the crews of Sea Shepherd do set an example for countries around the world. China is illegally fishing off the east and west coast of Africa and just China's eating Africa's lunch. They're stealing all their fish. Except Sea Shepherd is out there with crews on the bow, Marines armed with weapons, giving Sea Shepherd enforcement authority by crewing with half a dozen African countries, east and west coast, to give them the authority of the nation that wants Sea Shepherd to help them protect their resources, because they don't have the money for these kind of vessels. So, and thanks to the billionaires and the millionaires that are funding Sea Shepherd, and a lot of good, I don't know if you saw it tonight, Greenpeace in Poland had a vessel that was docked at shore about coal being burned in Poland and being offloaded at a port, and Sea Shepherd, the Polish police, can't be friendly, can't be that nice, came in with sledgehammers, broke all the windows in the Rainbow Warrior, and arrested the Greenpeace activists on board the crew for a peaceful protest against coal. So the forces of greed, the forces of capitalism, the forces of evil, of overfishing, of no morality in thinking about the future, these forces are greater, I'm sad to say, than the forces of good. But there are some glimmers of hope. And this man is meeting with one of my heroes, David Helvar, who organized over and over again for years the Blue Frontier, the Peter Benchley Awards, the March in Washington for the Ocean, and they're doing they have an evening here. So Helvar and Jason, it's a 1-2 punch. You ought to come see it. I hope to be here myself.
And I'll try to get Paul Watson out here, so I'll work on that. All right, everybody, get home safe.